He broke his last dry piece of bread for a stranger. By sunrise, the ground trembled beneath the weight of 100 Apache horses. Before we go further, you have to understand the kind of cold that settles over the western plains in the dead of winter. It is the kind of cold that does not just freeze the water in your tin cup, but tries to freeze the hope right out of your chest. The winter wind howled across a dying frontier town, tearing at the loose wooden boards of an abandoned barn that sat isolated at the very edge of the empty territory. Inside that drafty, forgotten shell lived Toby, a scrawny white orphan boy whose small hands were permanently stained with the pale, unforgiving dust of the trail. He had nothing to his name but a thin, frayed wool blanket and a single, hardened piece of sourdough bread that was meant to keep him alive for the rest of the bitter week. The sun had long surrendered to the freezing night, leaving the boy shivering in the dark corners of the barn, trying desperately to ignore the gnawing, painful ache in his empty stomach. That was when a heavy, unnatural thud echoed against the heavy barn door. It was not the wind. Toby froze in the shadows, his small fingers tightening instinctively around the stale crust of bread. He crept slowly toward the cracked timber and peered through the darkness. A man lay collapsed in the frozen dirt just outside the threshold. He was a native Apache traveler, his dark skin bruised by the elements and his breathing dangerously shallow, fighting a losing battle against the biting frost. Blood stained the side of his woven leather shirt, dark and heavy in the pale moonlight. Toby hesitated. Out here in the untamed territory, kindness was an expensive luxury that no one could afford, and food was worth far more than gold. Giving away his meager rations could mean his own quiet death before the spring thaw ever arrived. His throat felt dry as desert sand. He remembered the harsh lessons of the frontier town, the hardened men who always looked away when someone fell, the cold indifference of survival at any cost. He almost turned his back on the stranger. He almost walked back to his corner to eat his bread in the dark. Almost. But the fallen man let out a ragged, trembling breath that sounded entirely too much like the dying gasps of the boy's own father from years ago. Toby slowly pushed the heavy barn door open, the rusted hinges screaming out into the quiet night. He knelt beside the fallen man, the freezing mud immediately seeping into the knees of his worn trousers. The stranger did not open his eyes. He just laid there, completely defenseless against the unforgiving elements. Toby did not say a word. He did not ask for a name. He simply reached into his ragged canvas coat pocket, pulled out the rock-hard sourdough, and snapped it in two. The sound was sharp, echoing like a breaking branch in the heavy, oppressive silence. With trembling fingers, he placed the larger half onto the man's chest and gently pushed a dented tin cup of icy water toward his cracked lips. The boy did not wait for a thank you. He did not ask what violent storm had brought the man to this desolate edge of the world. He just retreated back into the shadows of the barn, pulling his thin blanket tighter around his shaking shoulders. That night, the physical cost of his mercy arrived. The cold came harder than it ever had before. Toby curled into a tight ball on the old hay, his stomach twisting in violent, painful knots, wondering if he would even wake to see the morning sun. The silence of the plains pressed in on him, heavy and absolute, isolating him from the rest of the living world. But sometime past midnight, the wind began to change. It carried something else, something low, distant, a slow, rhythmic thrumming that began to vibrate through the frozen earth beneath him. The vibration grew from a distant, hollow hum into a heavy, unavoidable thunder that rattled the rusted nails of the decaying barn and shook the dust from the wooden rafters. Toby pressed his thin hands against the freezing dirt floor, feeling the unmistakable, rhythmic weight of approaching horses echoing through his own bones. Out on this desolate stretch of the frontier, a night ride of this massive scale usually meant only one thing, and it was never a promise of salvation. He held his shallow breath, his heart hammering against his ribs, fully expecting the sharp, terrifying crack of repeating rifles or the fiery, unnatural glow of thrown torches to suddenly pierce through the wide cracks in the weathered wood. But there was absolutely no shouting. There was no gunfire breaking the bitter night. The only sound in the dark was the synchronized crunch of hundreds of heavy hooves breaking through the frozen crust of the earth, moving forward with a disciplined, terrifying purpose that felt worse than any chaotic raid. As the first pale streaks of winter dawn began to bleed slowly over the jagged eastern horizon, the thundering noise outside suddenly ceased, replaced instantly by a stillness so profound and heavy that it made the boy's ears ring. Toby slowly pushed himself up from the damp hay, his young joints aching violently from the relentless cold of the night. He crept toward the front of the barn, his worn leather boots making no sound at all against the packed dirt. With trembling, numb fingers, he peered through a wide gap in the splintered timber, the breath completely caught in his dry throat. The empty, snow-dusted plains from the night before were entirely gone. In their place stood a massive, breathing wall of horses and men. Dozens of native Apache warriors at first glance. But as the gray morning light stretched further across the dying valley, the boy realized with a sinking dread that there were hundreds of them. They formed a perfect, unbroken half-circle around the fragile wooden structure, their dark, leather-clad silhouettes cutting sharp, imposing lines against the brightening sky. Every single rider sat perfectly still upon their mounts, their warm breath pluming in the freezing morning air like smoke rising from hundreds of small, quiet fires. No weapons were drawn, but the sheer, overwhelming presence of that many hardened men in one place was enough to crush the air right out of the boy's lungs. Toby knew immediately that he could not hide from this. The harsh frontier had already taught him that hiding only delayed the inevitable, and usually made the final cost much worse. He swallowed the dry, painful lump of fear in his throat, his wide eyes darting frantically around the dark shadows of the barn until he found a broken, heavy wooden wagon spoke resting in the dirt. It was entirely useless against a small army, but his trembling hands gripped the splintered wood anyway, his small knuckles turning bone white from the strain. He closed his eyes for just a second, remembering the quiet way his father had told him to always face his end standing up on his own 2 feet. The heavy barn door protested with a loud, agonizing creak as Toby pushed it open, stepping out into the freezing, unforgiving morning light. He stood alone on the threshold, a scrawny, shivering orphan boy holding a broken piece of wood against a vast, silent army. The sheer scale of the gathering pressed down on him from all sides, and for a long, agonizing moment, the entire territory seemed to hold its collective breath. The bitter morning wind died down entirely as the orphan boy stood his ground, his small, bruised hands gripping the splintered wagon spoke so tightly that his knuckles ached with the freezing strain. He waited for the first war cry, for the thunderous charge of angry hooves that would surely trample him into the frozen dirt of the frontier, but the massive wall of hardened Apache warriors remained impossibly still. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sharp snorts of the war horses and the creak of worn leather saddles under the pale, rising winter sun. Toby could feel the collective weight of hundreds of dark eyes staring down at his fragile, shivering frame, judging the meager defense he had managed to pull from the ruins of the abandoned barn. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight, silently wishing that his father were standing beside him just one last time. Then, a slow, deliberate movement broke the stillness at the very center of the imposing formation. The warriors gently pulled back on their heavy leather reins, parting seamlessly like the dark waters of a deep river to make way for a solitary rider advancing from the rear. The man rode a towering, jet-black Mustang that moved with a quiet, undeniable authority, its heavy hooves crunching softly against the frost-covered earth. Toby narrowed his tired, wind-stung eyes against the harsh morning glare, his ragged breathing hitching sharply in his chest as the silent rider drew closer. It was the stranger from the freezing night before. The native traveler who had collapsed in the agonizing cold, bleeding and seemingly defeated, now sat tall and unyielding upon his magnificent mount, wrapped in thick furs and carrying the unmistakable, commanding presence of a high chief. The desperate vulnerability of his previous struggle was entirely gone, replaced by the quiet dignity of a man who held the fate of the entire empty territory in his steady hands. The chief brought his horse to a gentle halt just a few paces from where the boy stood trembling. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved a single muscle. The chief looked down at the pathetic piece of broken wood in Toby's shaking hands, his dark, weathered face completely unreadable. He slowly reached into the folds of his heavy winter coat, a sudden, deliberate motion that made the boy flinch and instinctively brace for a final, fatal strike. But the man did not draw a hunting knife or a heavy iron revolver. Instead, he pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden coin, its worn surface polished smooth by generations of careful hands. He held it high in the crisp morning air, letting the pale sunlight catch the deep grooves of its ancient design. The effect was immediate and absolute. As if struck by an invisible, powerful force, the hundreds of seasoned warriors surrounding the barn moved in perfect, disciplined unison. They did not shout. They did not raise their heavy rifles in victory. They simply swung down from their saddles, the synchronized thud of their boots hitting the frozen ground echoing like a single, massive heartbeat across the desolate plains. One by one, the fierce riders bowed their heads and dropped to their knees in the cold dust, submitting entirely to the undeniable weight of the carved wooden symbol. Toby's grip on the splintered wagon spoke finally faltered. The useless piece of wood slipped from his numb, frozen fingers and hit the dirt with a dull, hollow thud, leaving the scrawny orphan boy standing completely unarmed, surrounded by a silent, kneeling army that stretched as far as the eye could see. No one argued when he said it, but the silence that followed was not agreement. It was resistance, quiet and coiled, like something waiting for the right moment to push back, and I could feel it in the way the crowd held itself, the way their eyes moved between Sheriff Reed and Caleb, as if choosing sides without wanting to admit they had to choose at all. The rope around my neck hung looser now, no longer pulling, but still there, a reminder that nothing had been undone yet, only delayed. Reed stepped back from me. Slowly, his attention already shifting forward, past the platform, past the weight of what had almost happened, and into what came next. "Untie her hands," he said, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that did not need to be raised. The man behind me hesitated, just for a second, looking toward the crowd like he needed permission, like the town had always been the one in charge, not the badge. "Now," Reed added, and that was enough. The rope at my wrists loosened, rough fibers sliding against skin that had already learned not to flinch, and when my hands finally came free, I did not move them right away. I just let them rest, steady, because freedom given too quickly could look like fear, and I would not give them that either. I stepped down from the platform on my own, slow, deliberate, boots meeting the ground that had already decided I did not belong on it, and for a moment, no one made space for me. Then, gradually they did. Not out of kindness, out of uncertainty. And uncertainty had its own kind of power. Sheriff Reed did not look at me as I stepped beside him, but I could feel his awareness, sharp, measured, like he was placing me not as a suspect anymore, but as part of something he needed to understand. "You will stay within town limits," he said quietly, "just for me. Not a command, not a threat, just a condition." I nodded once. "I was not planning on leaving," I replied. His gaze flicked toward me briefly, and for a second, something almost like approval passed through it before disappearing again. Ahead of us, Caleb had not moved far, but he had not stayed still either. He stood just beyond the edge of the crowd now, not retreating, but no longer at the center, and that shift alone said more than anything he had spoken. "This is not over," he said, his voice carrying again, trying to reclaim the ground he had lost. "You are letting her walk after everything." Reed turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough. "I am letting the truth walk," he said. "If that makes you uncomfortable, you should ask yourself why." That landed clean, and I saw it hit, not just Caleb, but the others too, the men who had stood behind him without question, now, standing with nothing but their own silence. The town did not know what to do with that. They knew how to judge. They knew how to follow. But thinking for themselves, that was something else entirely. I flexed my fingers once, feeling the blood return, the faint sting reminding me I was still here, still standing, still not what they had tried to make me. And then, without planning to, I spoke again. "The man who died," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the low murmur that had started to rise. He was not trying to hurt me. The words pulled everything back into focus. Reed looked at me fully now. "Then what was he doing?" he asked. I held his gaze, letting the memory settle into something clear enough to speak. "He was trying to stop someone else," I said. The crowd stilled again, the uncertainty deepening into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Behind them, The boy watched, silent now, but no less important, and somewhere beyond the buildings, a door slammed in the distance, sharp and sudden, like the world itself refusing to stay quiet any longer. Reed's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in thought, connecting pieces that had not fit before. "Then we have been asking the wrong question," he said. And in that moment, I understood something I had not allowed myself to believe until now. This was no longer about proving I was innocent. It was about proving who had made sure no one would believe it in the first place. This is one of those unforgettable Western stories where a small act of kindness in the brutal frontier leads to a massive and unexpected reward. The freezing winter night brings a dying native traveler to the door of an abandoned barn where a young white orphan boy is struggling to survive the cold. Unlike many other Western stories that focus on violence and revenge, this tale highlights the profound cost of mercy when the boy gives away his absolute last piece of dry bread to the stranger. The true power of these Western stories lies in the quiet moments of silent respect, which is proven the very next morning when the ground trembles and a massive native army surrounds the boy's fragile wooden shelter. Fans of gripping Western stories will be captivated as the helpless stranger from the night before is revealed to be a powerful high chief who has returned not to conquer, but to honor a debt with a sacred wooden coin. Ultimately, the best Western stories remind us that even in a harsh and unforgiving world, true authority bows to the pure and selfless heart of a child. The thick pale dust kicked up by the departing Apache horses hung suspended in the freezing winter air long after the last dark rider vanished over the jagged eastern ridge. Toby remained completely motionless in the frozen, blood-stained dirt of his ruined yard, the intricately carved wooden coin burning with an unexpected, comforting warmth against the numb skin of his palm. The heavy wooden shutters of the dying frontier town, which had remained cowardly locked and barred throughout the terrifying morning, now began to groan open one by one along the desolate main street. The silence that settled over the valley was no longer the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but rather a tense, suffocating stillness born of pure shock and shifting power. Men who had previously kicked the scrawny orphan out of their liveries, and women who had purposefully crossed the muddy street to avoid the sight of his ragged canvas coat, now stepped tentatively onto their frost-covered porches. Their eyes, wide with lingering terror and a sudden, sickening realization, darted frantically between the empty horizon where the native army had disappeared and the shivering boy who had just brought the most feared warriors in the territory to their knees. The local saloon owner, a heavily built, ruthless man who had once thrown Toby into an icy horse trough simply for begging for stale crusts, was the first to break the invisible barrier. He wiped his trembling, sweaty hands on his stained apron and took a slow, calculated step toward the edge of the abandoned barn's property, forcing an unnaturally sweet, desperate smile onto his weathered face. "Now, Toby, my boy," the saloon owner called out, his voice cracking pitifully in the biting wind as he tried to project an image of sudden, lifelong friendship. "There is absolutely no need for you to be staying out here in this freezing old barn anymore. So why don't you come inside where it is warm and we can get you a proper hot meal?" Toby did not answer him, nor did he even turn his head to acknowledge the man's sudden, transparent change of heart. The boy simply lowered his tired eyes, his thumb gently tracing the deep, ancestral grooves of the wooden token, remembering perfectly the harsh, unforgiving lessons this exact town had beaten into him since the day his father was buried in a pauper's grave. The saloon owner, mistaking the boy's heavy silence for the usual timid submission of a hungry orphan, took another greedy step closer, his eyes fixed hungrily on the wooden coin, clearly calculating the immense, untouchable protection it represented in this brutal, untamed land. He reached out a thick, calloused hand, his shadow falling over the very spot where the dying native traveler had collapsed the night before. But as the man's heavy leather boot crossed the invisible line in the dust where the high chief's towering black Mustang had just stood, the cold wind suddenly picked up, howling through the cracks of the barn like a warning from the earth itself. Toby finally looked up, his pale blue eyes devoid of any childlike innocence, reflecting only the harsh, unyielding truth of the plains. He didn't step back, he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't reach for the broken wagon spoke lying in the dirt. He simply closed his small hand entirely over the wooden coin and held his ground with the terrifying, quiet authority of a boy who was no longer fighting for survival. The saloon owner froze mid-step, his fake smile dropping instantly as he looked from the boy's unwavering stare to the endless tracks of 100 warhorses pressed deep into the frozen mud. Without another word, the large man slowly lowered his empty hands, swallowed hard, and stumbled backward toward the supposed safety of his saloon, leaving the orphan standing perfectly undisturbed in the center of the yard. The brutal afternoon sun offered no real warmth as it crawled across the faded wooden facades of the dying frontier town, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to actively avoid the ruined yard of the abandoned barn. Inside the drafty structure, Toby sat perfectly still on his makeshift bed of frozen hay, the intricately carved wooden coin resting heavily on his worn canvas knees. For the first time in his short, miserable life, the gnawing, violent ache of starvation in his stomach was entirely overshadowed by the suffocating weight of the sudden, unnatural isolation pressing in from all sides. The townspeople, the same hardened men and women who had spent years casually kicking dirt onto his worn boots and ignoring his desperate pleas for winter scraps, had completely vanished behind their locked wooden doors and heavily barred windows. The bustling, chaotic noise of the main street, the clinking of cheap whiskey glasses, the heavy thud of blacksmith hammers, the constant shouting of drunken drovers, had died entirely, replaced by a tense, ringing silence that felt thicker than the impending winter snow. As the pale sun finally began to dip below the jagged eastern ridge, painting the bruised sky in deep shades of violet and blood red, Toby heard the soft, hesitant crunch of boots on the frost-covered dirt outside. He did not flinch, nor did he reach for the useless, splintered wagon spoke that still lay discarded near the threshold. Through a wide gap in the decaying timber, he watched a nervous, trembling shadow approach the edge of his invisible boundary. It was the baker's wife, a stern, unforgiving woman who had once chased him away from her cooling racks with a heavy iron broom. She did not dare to cross into the yard. Her hands shook violently as she placed a large, steaming loaf of fresh sourdough bread and a thick cut of salted meat onto an old, overturned whiskey barrel at the edge of the property, her terrified eyes darting constantly toward the dark, empty horizon as if expecting the massive native army to suddenly materialize from the shadows. She backed away slowly, her head bowed in forced, fearful submission, before turning and practically running back to the perceived safety of her heavy oak door. Toby stared at the rich, warm food through the crack in the wood. His dry throat swallowed hard, the overwhelming scent of roasted meat pulling violently at his starving senses. He remembered the excruciating pain of the previous night, the desperate, trembling moment when he had snapped his last dry crust in two for a dying stranger, fully accepting his own quiet death in the freezing mud. He slowly pushed himself up from the hay, his worn boots making no sound as he walked to the threshold and stepped out into the biting evening wind. He stood before the barrel, looking down at the feast that had been born entirely of cowardice and dread. He did not reach for the bread. Instead, his small fingers closed tightly around the warm wooden coin in his pocket. He looked past the food, past the locked buildings of the cowardly town, and fixed his gaze entirely on the distant, darkening tree line, where a single, solitary hawk circled silently in the freezing air, a quiet, unexpected sign that the true watchers of the plains had not truly left him behind. The bitter cold gnawed at his exposed wrists as he stood there, the heavy silence of the frontier stretching out like a vast, empty ocean. Out here, survival was usually a simple, brutal equation of force and cruelty, but the carved token burning in his pocket had completely rewritten the ancient rules of the dirt. He reached out slowly, not to take the offering, but to push the heavy loaf of bread slightly to the side, exposing the raw, frozen wood of the barrel underneath. He knew that if he ate their fear, he would become just another hardened, hollow piece of this dying settlement. He turned his back on the steaming meat, leaving it to freeze in the harsh night air, and walked steadily back into the deep shadows of the barn, the heavy timber door creaking shut behind him. The town had offered him a feast, but the orphan boy had already learned that the most filling things in this unforgiving territory could not be bought, stolen, or begged for. They could only be given away in the dark, when absolutely no one else was looking. The brutal winter tightened its grip on the isolated frontier settlement over the next 2 weeks, burying the muddy main street under heavy, unforgiving drifts of pale snow. Some folks in that territory still whisper about that specific winter. They do not talk loud, just quiet enough to remind themselves that certain forces in the West simply cannot be frozen out. Yet, the drafty, abandoned barn at the edge of the territory no longer felt like a freezing tomb for the scrawny orphan boy. Toby survived the deep freeze not because the jagged, rotting wooden planks suddenly kept the howling wind out, but because the undeniable, lingering fear of the High Chief had fundamentally altered the cowardly behavior of the surviving townspeople. Every single morning, long before the pale winter sun could even breach the jagged eastern ridge, a fresh stack of chopped pine firewood and a small, tightly wrapped parcel of dried provisions would miraculously appear at the exact invisible boundary line where the towering black Mustang had once stood. The townspeople never showed their faces when they left these desperate offerings, terrified that the boy might actually look them in the eye and see the hollow, festering guilt hiding beneath their heavy winter coats. They treated the ruined, snow-covered yard like a sacred, untouchable burial ground, stepping incredibly lightly and speaking only in hurried whispers whenever they were forced to walk anywhere near the property. Toby never once thanked the baker, the blacksmith, or the saloon owner for the dry wood or the salted pork, knowing perfectly well that their sudden, overwhelming generosity was fueled entirely by the terrifying memory of 100 seasoned Apache warriors kneeling in the frost. He simply stepped out into the biting morning wind, gathered the supplies in absolute silence, and retreated into the dark shadows, his small, calloused fingers constantly tracing the deep, ancient grooves of the wooden coin resting warmly in his pocket. He remembered a bitter, freezing night from many years ago when his father had quietly told him that a man's true worth was never measured by what people handed him in the light, but by what they desperately tried to take from him in the dark. The local sheriff, a tall, hollow-eyed man with a rusted tin star pinned to his heavy leather duster, spent endless days watching the boy from the supposed safety of the saloon porch. The lawman had never lifted a single finger to help Toby when the boy was starving in the frozen muddy alleys. But now, the overwhelming, unseen presence of the native token gnawed violently at his fragile, manufactured authority. He desperately wanted to cross the snow-covered yard, to demand the wooden coin and reassert his dominance over the broken settlement. But his worn, leather boots remained firmly planted on the warped wooden planks of the porch. The sheer, suffocating weight of the invisible protection surrounding the orphan was simply too massive for any sensible man to challenge, and the sheriff knew that drawing a weapon against that kind of power would only invite an absolute slaughter. Sometime during the 3rd week of the relentless freeze, a violent, blinding blizzard rolled directly out of the northern plains, bringing a solid wall of white that threatened to completely bury the entire territory. The storm shrieked through the empty streets, tearing loose shutters from their rusted iron hinges and burying the cowardly town under massive, suffocating snowdrifts. Inside the dark barn, a steady fire crackled warmly in an old, cracked iron stove that had been anonymously dragged to the edge of the yard just days before. Toby sat silently near the dancing flames, the flickering orange light washing across his dirt-stained cheeks and reflecting brightly in his tired, unblinking eyes. He held the carved wooden coin up to the firelight, watching closely how the deep shadows shifted inside the ancestral markings. For a boy who had spent his entire short life being completely invisible to the world, the sudden, overwhelming weight of being the most protected soul in the territory was a remarkably heavy burden to carry. He did not feel powerful, and he did not feel triumphant over the men who had endlessly wronged him. He just felt incredibly, deeply tired. As the blizzard raged violently against the trembling wooden walls of the barn, tearing at the patched roof with freezing claws, Toby did not flinch or cower in the dark corners like he used to do. He simply pulled his oversized canvas coat much tighter around his thin, shivering shoulders and watched the glowing embers slowly turn to gray ash, fully aware that the fiercest, most destructive storms in the untamed West were never truly born in the dark winter clouds, but rather in the frightened, desperate hearts of weak men. The violent, howling blizzard finally shattered on the morning of the fourth day, leaving behind a blinding, suffocating blanket of pure white and a silence so profoundly deep that it felt as though the entire western frontier had quietly died during the night. The pale, fragile winter sun crept slowly over the jagged eastern ridge, casting long, sharp blue shadows across the deeply buried main street of the terrified settlement. Inside the drafty, abandoned barn, Toby let the rusted iron stove burn down to a pile of glowing gray embers, his small, dirt-stained hand still resting heavily inside the frayed pocket that held the warm, intricately carved wooden coin. The brutal, unforgiving cold of the storm had finally broken, but the desperate, gnawing hunger of the wild territory had not. Just before noon, the heavy, muffled crunch of exhausted horses violently breaking through the chest-high snowdrifts echoed through the absolute stillness of the frozen valley. 5 hardened, half-frozen riders appeared at the desolate edge of town, their heavy leather dusters completely caked in thick, dirty ice, and their faces wrapped tightly in filthy, frozen wool scarves. They were not local drovers, and they certainly were not lawmen. They were desperate, starving outlaws who had been caught dead in the middle of the punishing whiteout and had barely survived the freezing night by riding their mounts to the absolute edge of death. They rode slowly and deliberately down the center of the buried main street, their sunken, bloodshot eyes scanning the tightly locked and heavily barred wooden doors of the cowardly townspeople. The local sheriff watched them from the dark, safe crack of the saloon shutters, his trembling hand resting uselessly on the grip of his rusted iron revolver, completely unwilling to risk his own skin to enforce any kind of law against starving, desperate men. The leader of the outlaws, a massive, broad-shouldered man with a jagged, ugly scar running down his heavily frost-bitten cheek, instantly spotted the thin, inviting trail of gray smoke rising steadily from the patched roof of Toby's decaying barn. Out here in the brutal, untamed West, a warm fire and a dry roof belonged entirely to the men violent enough to take them, and a fragile wooden shelter sitting isolated at the very edge of a terrified town was an incredibly easy, irresistible prize. The massive man spurred his exhausted, violently shivering horse forward, leading his brutal, silent gang straight toward the exact invisible boundary line that the entire settlement had spent weeks treating like sacred, untouchable ground. Inside the dark, quiet barn, Toby heard the heavy, irregular thud of the approaching hooves long before the outlaws actually reached the snow-covered yard. He remembered perfectly the suffocating, terrifying weight of the massive Apache army surrounding him in the dark, but this new sound was entirely different. It was messy, chaotic, and driven entirely by pure, selfish desperation. The orphan slowly stood up from the dry hay, his worn leather boots making absolutely no sound as he walked steadily toward the heavy timber door. He did not search the dirt for the broken wagon spoke, and he did not try to cower in the deep shadows like the terrified, grown men currently hiding behind their locked wooden walls in the town. The leader of the gang pulled his towering horse to a sudden, exhausted halt right at the edge of the property, entirely oblivious to the hundreds of massive hoofprints still buried deep beneath the fresh winter snow. He swung down heavily from his worn, creaking leather saddle, his frozen boots hitting the ground with a dull, threatening crunch, and immediately drew a heavy iron revolver from his worn hip holster. The sharp, metallic click of the heavy hammer being pulled back sliced violently through the quiet winter air, a universal, unforgiving language that every single living soul in the western plains understood perfectly. Toby slowly pushed the heavy barn door open, the rusted hinges groaning loudly, and stepped out into the blinding, freezing sunlight to face the 5 hardened killers completely unarmed. The massive outlaw lowered his weapon slightly, letting out a dry, raspy laugh that sounded exactly like cracking ice, incredibly amused by the pathetic, scrawny white orphan boy standing proudly in his oversized canvas coat, while the rest of the silent, cowardly town held its collective breath in the dark, desperately waiting to see if the unseen, terrifying protection of the native high chief could actually stop a starving man's bullet. The massive outlaw with the frostbitten scar let out another cruel, rasping laugh that sounded exactly like heavy boots crushing dry ice. His heavy iron revolver aimed squarely at Toby's thin, shivering chest. The scrawny orphan boy did not flinch or beg for his life, his freezing, dirt-stained fingers simply tightening around the intricately carved wooden coin hidden deep inside the frayed pocket of his oversized canvas coat. The four other starving outlaws swung down heavily from their exhausted, violently shivering horses, their worn leather saddles creaking loudly in the deep snow as they spread out with brutal intent, eager to claim the warm fire and whatever meager supplies the boy was hiding inside the drafty, decaying barn. From the safety of the dark, freezing saloon across the buried main street, the cowardly sheriff and the terrified townspeople watched through the narrow, splintered cracks in their heavy wooden shutters, fully expecting the ruthless killers to slaughter the forgotten boy and finally rid their settlement of the unnatural, suffocating tension that had paralyzed them for nearly a month. The outlaw leader took a heavy, threatening step closer to the invisible boundary line of the yard, his calloused finger resting dangerously on the hair trigger of his rusted weapon, loudly demanding that Toby step aside and surrender the property to men who were willing to take it by force. But before his worn, snow-caked boot could strike the packed frost of the boy's yard, a strange, unnatural sound sliced violently through the absolute stillness of the frozen valley. It was not the familiar, howling shriek of the bitter winter wind or the thunder of approaching horses, but a sharp, terrifyingly synchronized metallic click echoing directly from the dense, snow-heavy pine trees that bordered the absolute edge of the dying town. The outlaw leader froze completely mid-step, the cruel, mocking smile instantly vanishing from his scarred face as his experienced, survival-hardened ears immediately recognized the unmistakable sound of dozens of heavy, repeating rifles being cocked simultaneously in the deep shadows. He slowly lowered his rusted revolver, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically toward the jagged, blinding tree line, trying desperately to pierce the harsh glare of the winter sun reflecting off the massive snowdrifts. At first, there was absolutely nothing to see but the pale, unbroken wilderness, but then the deep shadows beneath the heavy, snow-laden pine branches began to subtly shift and detach themselves from the dark wooden trunks. They had never actually left the valley. The fierce native Apache warriors, wrapped entirely in pure white winter furs that made them completely invisible against the unforgiving, snow-covered plains, slowly materialized from the frozen, dead brush, their heavy rifles and tightly drawn hunting bows aimed with deadly, unflinching precision straight at the five desperate outlaws. There were not just a few passing scouts. There were dozens of them, standing perfectly still like ancient, vengeful ghosts of the western frontier, forming an impenetrable, lethal ring around the abandoned barn and the boy who lived inside it. The High Chief's protection was not merely a symbolic promise left in the dust of the yard, but a breathing, heavily armed reality that had been silently, relentlessly watching over the scrawny orphan boy through every single freezing night and every blinding, destructive blizzard. The outlaw leader's raspy breath hitched violently in his dry throat, his dark, sunken eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as he suddenly realized the catastrophic, fatal mistake his gang had just made. He looked back at Toby, really looking at him this time, finally noticing the unnatural, absolute calm resting in the boy's pale blue eyes, a quiet, terrifying authority that no starving orphan should ever possess in the face of a loaded gun. The massive killer slowly raised his empty left hand in a desperate, trembling gesture of absolute surrender, fully aware that even a single, panicked twitch of his trigger finger would result in the immediate, violent annihilation of his entire crew. The four other outlaws followed suit, dropping their heavy weapons into the deep snow without making a single sound, their weakened knees shaking violently as the suffocating, crushing weight of the unseen army pressed down on them from the frozen trees. Toby stood completely motionless on the threshold of the barn, his small shoulders squared against the biting morning cold, realizing for the first time that the wooden coin burning in his pocket was not just a token of past gratitude, but a permanent, unbreakable bond of blood and iron that commanded the absolute loyalty of the fiercest watchers in the untamed territory. The entire cowardly town watched in stunned, breathless silence as the most dangerous, ruthless outlaws in the region were entirely disarmed and broken without a single shot ever being fired, absolutely paralyzed by the invisible, towering presence of the native warriors who refused to let their sworn protector come to any harm. The 5 outlaws, completely stripped of their weapons and their manufactured frontier bravery, stood trembling violently in the knee-deep snow while the silent, unbroken ring of Apache warriors held their aim with terrifying, unflinching precision. Toby did not issue a single panicked command to the towering native protectors, because he simply did not have to. The intricately carved wooden coin burning hotly inside the frayed pocket of his oversized canvas coat had already spoken volumes on his behalf. The townspeople, still cowering like frightened, helpless mice behind the heavily barred wooden windows of the dark saloon and the general store, watched in absolute, stunned silence as the massive, scarred outlaw leader slowly fell to his knees in the freezing, blood-stained dirt. He was a ruthless, hardened man who had survived countless violent skirmishes across the untamed Western Territory. But looking up into the unblinking, dark eyes of the fierce native warriors emerging from the winter tree line, he finally understood the true, crushing weight of his fatal mistake. Without a single word being spoken to break the heavy tension of the morning, 2 tall warriors wrapped entirely in thick white wolf pelts stepped smoothly out of the dense pine shadows and walked purposefully toward the shivering, defeated gang. They did not strike the outlaws or draw their heavy hunting knives, adhering strictly to a silent, ancient code of honor that was entirely foreign to the brutal, chaotic frontier settlement. Over the ruthless invaders, they simply melted back into the dense, snow-heavy pine branches exactly as quietly as they had appeared, leaving absolutely no trace of their imposing presence except for the heavy, lingering silence that now blanketed the entire terrified settlement. The cowardly sheriff finally let out a long, ragged breath from his hiding spot inside the dark, freezing saloon, his trembling hands violently shaking as he fully realized that the law of the dying town had just been permanently rewritten by a forgotten child. Toby did not look toward the frightened townspeople or acknowledge their pathetic, silent awe. He just turned around, his oversized canvas coat brushing softly against the splintered doorframe, and walked calmly back into the comforting shadows of his fragile home. He sat down near the crackling warmth of the iron stove, the deep, ancestral grooves of the chief's coin resting heavily on his worn knee, deeply understanding that true power in the untamed West was never actually measured by the number of guns a man carried, but by the quiet, unbreakable promises that watched over him when the terrible winter storms finally broke. The brutal, endless winter finally began to loosen its suffocating, freezing grip on the terrified frontier settlement late in the month of March, slowly turning the massive, waist-high snowdrifts into heavy, rushing rivers of dark mud that eventually swallowed the deep, ancestral hoofprints left behind by the Apache army. Despite the physical, frozen evidence of the native warriors melting away into the softening earth, the invisible, towering boundary line that had been silently drawn around the abandoned barn only grew stronger and more absolute with every single passing day. The cowardly townspeople, the exact same hardened men and women who had spent years casually treating the scrawny white orphan like a stray, disease-ridden dog, now treated him with a level of profound, terrified reverence usually reserved for the most dangerous gunslingers or the wealthiest cattle barons in the Western Territory. Toby no longer had to desperately scavenge for frozen, stale crusts of bread behind the foul-smelling local saloon or beg for small scraps of meat near the slaughterhouse. Every single morning, exactly at the break of dawn, a heavy wooden crate filled with warm, fresh sourdough, thick cuts of smoked bacon, and perfectly chopped dry pine would be waiting right at the absolute edge of his muddy yard. The stern baker and the hollow-eyed, useless sheriff never once waited around to see the boy actually collect the desperate offerings, terrified that making direct eye contact with the child might somehow summon the silent, lethal watchers out from the dense, dark shadows of the distant pine trees. Toby would quietly step out into the crisp, warming spring air, his oversized, dirt-stained canvas coat finally hanging open against the gentle, returning sun, and slowly gather the heavy supplies without ever uttering a single word of gratitude or acknowledging the desperate, anxious eyes peering through the splintered cracks of the distant town shutters. He understood perfectly well that this sudden, overwhelming wave of frontier generosity had absolutely nothing to do with genuine kindness or sudden moral regret, but was entirely born from the deep, paralyzing fear that the High Chief had permanently planted in their weak, hollow chests. One late, lazy afternoon, as the heavy golden sunlight began to stretch long, warm shadows across the muddy main street, Toby made the deliberate decision to walk directly into the center of the town for the very first time since the freezing, desperate night he had broken his last piece of dry bread for the dying stranger. He did not carry a rusted knife, and he did not puff out his small, fragile chest in a foolish attempt to look intimidating or tough. He simply walked with the quiet, steady, unbreakable rhythm of a boy who knew exactly what kind of massive, unseen power walked right beside him in the dust. As his worn, mud-caked leather boots hit the warped wooden planks of the general store's long, covered porch, the usual loud, chaotic chatter of the drunken drovers and the bargaining local merchants died instantly, immediately replaced by a tense, suffocating silence that actually felt heavier and far more oppressive than the worst of the winter blizzards. Grown, violent men carrying heavy iron revolvers and drinking cheap, burning whiskey literally stepped aside, without a single word of protest, parting seamlessly like a frightened flock of sheep to give the fragile, scrawny orphan a remarkably wide, deeply respectful berth. Toby walked steadily right up to the thick wooden counter, his small, calloused fingers reaching deep into his frayed canvas coat pocket to gently pull out the intricately carved wooden coin. He did not rudely demand what he wanted, and he did not raise his young voice to threaten the men around him. He just rested his small hand casually near the ancient token, letting the deep, ancestral grooves catch the dim, flickering yellow light of the store's swinging oil lamps. The nervous, sweating store owner swallowed an incredibly hard, painful lump in his dry throat, his calloused hands shaking violently as he quickly and silently filled a large canvas sack with sweet red apples, pure white sugar, and the absolute finest cut of salted dried beef he had, pushing the heavy load across the scratched wooden counter without ever daring to ask for a single rusted penny in return. Toby did not smile triumphantly or childishly gloat over his newfound, unquestionable dominance over the exact same grown men who had once mercilessly kicked him into the freezing dirt of the alleyways. He just gave the terrified, pale store owner a slow, barely perceptible nod, effortlessly picked up the heavy canvas sack, and turned his back completely on the paralyzed, breathless crowd, walking steadily back out into the fading, blood-red western sun while the entire cowardly town held its collective breath, completely unable to comprehend the profound, terrifying cost of the simple mercy they had all failed to show. The heavy, torrential spring rains finally arrived the following week, violently washing away the last stubborn patches of winter snow and completely erasing the deep, ancestral hoofprints that the massive Apache warhorses had left pressed into the frozen mud. However, even with the physical evidence entirely gone, the invisible, towering boundary line that had been silently drawn around the decaying yard of the abandoned barn remained absolutely impenetrable, hanging over the terrified settlement like a suffocating, heavy dark cloud. Toby returned quietly from the terrified general store, the heavy canvas sack filled with pure white sugar, sweet red apples, and the absolute finest cuts of salted dried beef resting comfortably over his small, scrawny shoulder. As he walked steadily down the muddy main street, he did not bother to look back at the cowardly, hardened men and women who were still desperately staring at his small frame through the splintered, narrow cracks of their heavy wooden shutters. The boy simply walked with deliberate, unhurried steps into the deep, quiet shadows of his fragile home, the rusted, screaming iron hinges of the heavy timbered door groaning loudly before finally shutting out the harsh, fading red glare of the dying western sun. He set the heavy, incredibly valuable supplies down onto the warped wooden floorboards near the cold, cracked iron stove that had kept him alive through the brutal, unforgiving blizzards. With slow, trembling fingers, he reached deep into the frayed, dirt-stained pocket of his oversized canvas coat and gently pulled out the intricately carved wooden coin. The deep, ancient grooves of the token caught the dim, fading twilight bleeding softly through the massive gaps in the decaying roof, casting small, dancing shadows across his pale, bruised palm. For the absolute first time in his entire miserable, forgotten life, the orphan boy had absolutely everything he could possibly need to comfortably survive the harsh, violent frontier, and he wielded a terrifying, unseen authority that could effortlessly bring the entire cowardly town to its knees in a single, bloody night. But as he sat there in the heavy, oppressive silence of the empty barn, staring at the rich feast he had just taken without a single rusted penny, a deep, gnawing emptiness began to settle heavily into his chest. He remembered the excruciating, freezing night from a month ago, the agonizing, hollow ache in his stomach, and the sharp, resounding crack of his absolute last dry piece of sourdough bread breaking perfectly in two for a dying, bleeding stranger. He realized with a sudden, quiet clarity that the true power of the untamed territory did not belong to the men who hoarded food behind locked wooden doors, nor did it belong to those who wielded heavy iron revolvers to take what they wanted in the daylight. True authority belonged entirely to the wild, open plains, to the fierce, unseen watchers in the dark pine trees, and to the rare, fleeting moments of pure, selfless mercy that cost a man absolutely everything he had. Toby did not raise his small hand in a triumphant, arrogant victory, and he did not shout out a boastful warning to the cowardly sheriff hiding across the muddy street. He simply stood up from the dry hay, leaving the heavy canvas sack of rich, untouched food sitting completely abandoned next to the cold iron stove. He pushed the heavy barn door open one final time, stepping right past the invisible boundary line and out into the vast, darkening western wilderness. His worn, mud-caked leather boots crunched softly against the damp, fragrant spring earth as he walked steadily toward the jagged eastern ridge, heading directly toward the deep, shadowed tree line where the distant, rhythmic thrumming of heavy warhorses always seemed to echo softly in the evening wind. The cowardly townspeople watched in stunned, breathless silence as the boy completely disappeared into the untamed territory, leaving behind the protective shelter and the wealthy supplies they so desperately craved. And for generations to come, no one in that dying settlement ever dared to cross the empty yard or touch the rotting canvas sack, completely paralyzed by the lingering, terrifying memory of the scrawny white orphan who had conquered the brutal frontier with nothing but half a piece of dry bread.